should. It's a strong story.
So first off, name?
My name is Paul Flores.
And what was your, where do you come from?
I'm originally from a place called Chula Vista, California, which is on the border between California and I've spent the last 20 years living in San Francisco.
Okay. And when did you first start your career, as you may say?
I think I first began writing, I was 9 years old, and I originally began writing in order to communicate with my father, because he was a journalist living in Denver and I was living in San Diego, and so he would send me letters with his copies of his articles. Now, I didn't know what my father looked like, really. I didn't know what kind of a man he was, and so kind of my first experience with my father that I can remember was these articles that he sent me that he had written as a journalist for the Denver Post. He would sometimes send letters with them, and so I would try to understand the writing he was sending to me, and so I started writing letters back, but it wasn't a really good communication. So I think my first writing began about trying to get my father's attention, and I think as a young man, we want positive encouragement from adult males, you know, and I didn't have that from my own dad, so that motivated me to write in a lot of other situations about, you know, I feel like I had to prove myself all the time. So as I got older, from 9 years old, and I began writing letters, then I started writing poems, then I started writing little stories. I remember writing stories, you know, when I was 12 years old and turning them into my sixth grade teacher. You know, while other people were working on math or whatever, I was working on writing, and that's what I like to do in my alone time. I was the only child. I read a lot and I wrote a lot, trying to come up with finding what do I have in common with this guy called my dad. And sometimes I sent him stuff, sometimes I didn't. I remember my first poem got published when I was 22 years old. I had my first poem published. I was in college, and that poem was about searching for my father, trying to find him. I remember it, feeling like I wasn't doing very well. That poem was published in a small poetry magazine in San Diego called The Poetry Conspiracy, independently published little mag. I was invited to read for the publication of it, and I met all these other writers, much older than me. I was 22, and the majority of the people in that reading were a lot older. So at first, a lot of the people that I read for when I started writing poetry were older white folks, right? So, you know, I was writing about being a Latino boy from the border, not really having a good sense of his family and where, you know, how his family broke up. I ended up putting that on the paper. You know, that was putting my pain on the page, you know. And from there, I met other writers. So I really started writing seriously when I was in college. I was 22 years old. That was when I began. But it was an evolution from all the kind of inspiration I had gathered as a young man, you know, that trying to write to get the attention of my dad, to impress him with my writing, like he was trying to impress me by showing him his writing, showing me his writing, right? And from there, you know, I continued writing. I continued publishing. I started publishing in the UC San Diego literary magazine called Temper. From there, I applied to a MFA program in San Francisco State. I had some of the professors at UC San Diego support me, write me letters of recommendation. Quincy Troop was a big supporter of mine. He's a poet from San Diego. Well, he's a poet from East St. Louis, but he was working at UC San Diego. This guy, Melvin Freilicher, who was a fiction writer, supported my work. Victor Hernandez Cruz was supporting my work at that time. In fact, Quincy Troop was the guy who actually got me to write more about the Chicano experience, because he gave me Jimmy Santiago Baca's book, Martin and the Meditations. When I first saw that you could write poetry and like narrative, like story, and you could do Spanglish, and you could talk about, you know, the things that you saw at home and tell stories about your family, I started to do that, you know. I started writing about, you know, autobiographical poems that told stories, and then I started to get published, and then I leveraged some of the poetry about my own life into a political story. So what I was doing at that time was using my poetry to speak out against the Proposition 187, which was It was a piece of legislation that was passed in 1994 that denied all public services to undocumented immigrants. And since my grandfather was an immigrant from Jalisco, he often got harassed by the immigration. He was very dark skinned, and he dressed like a farm worker. You know, he had a sombrero a lot. He wore long sleeve shirts. And he was retired though, right? But he would often go pick people's cans and bottles out of their trash cans and take them and get them, recycle them. So a couple times, he got, a neighbor saw him going through their trash, and they called the police, and then the police started harassing him for, like, does he have his papers? My grandfather was already a citizen of the United States. He had naturalized himself, and so when Proposition 187 came out about trying to deny public services and encouraging people to snitch on immigrants, I wrote a poem about my grandfather, about how much pride I had in him, about how much he sacrificed for his family, to show that even though he wasn't born in the United States, he still gave a lot to this country, and for you to look at him as if he's less than you just because he's Mexican or darker skin color was a real disgrace and a shame, and I felt upset, So I wrote this poem, I read it, and I got invited to read it at a big rally on the border. I remember they invited me to read this poem. And I talked about, the border. I talked about, how Mexicans feel about this border, on both sides of the fence. Like, we feel like it separates us from our own family and whatnot, and our own history. So I wrote this poem, and there were a lot of students in the crowd. There were a lot of activists, and they liked this piece, because it was about what was happening in our state and in our community. So I got to read that poem like 6 or 7 times, and then I published it eventually, and then I started building this relationship to performing live. And so I started memorizing my poems, and then I started performing around town. Then I moved to San Francisco, and I moved to San Francisco to write a novel about growing up on the border. And the novel that I ended up writing was called Along the Border Lies, and it was published in 2002, and it was about growing up on the border between San Diego and Tijuana, where I spent a lot of time back and forth, watching how the whole militarization of the border changed our community. Because at one point, the border was just a small barbed wire fence that you literally could step over. You didn't even In fact, what we did with my friends, actually, we would take our BMX bikes down, because I lived like less than 2 miles from the border. We would ride our bikes to the border. It actually was divided by a canyon. In that canyon, we build jumps and stuff, right? So we had a BMX bike, so we would build jumps. Go out there, bring a shovel, dig some stuff, dig a hole, pat it down, and make jumps, right? Well, one time, one of my friends built a jump that actually went over the barbed wire of the fence of the border. So we actually rode our bikes, jumped over the barbed wire fence, and landed in Mexico. Turned around, jumped over the barbed wire fence, landed back in the United States. And that's what the border was like back in the 80s, right? But then in 1994, with Operation Border Keeper, they built a gigantic 10-foot fence. They started putting, tanks and infrared and razor wire and electric wire on the border. And all of a sudden, it became a militarized zone. It changed. It made our life more violent, right? So then supposedly it was to stop the immigration, but really I think it was to beef up the just kind of like put more money into militarization, spend money on weapons and whatnot. And at the same time is when the kind of narco traffic started to really build up in Tijuana. And so a couple of my friends got caught up, crossing weed across the border, and one of them ended up getting murdered over it in his own yard. And so I started thinking about how that changed went from me being in a happy childhood inside living on the border to an older youth, a young adult faced with so much violence that I felt was imposed by the government, not necessarily had anything to do with Mexico. Our own United States government kind of created that violence there. So I wrote a book about the change, how it went from, being a bi-cultural area into, literally a militarized zone because of, the government's response to immigration, the immigration policy, because of the way the demand for drugs in the United States was so huge. So the book was called Along the Border Lies, and I published that when I moved to San Francisco. While I was writing that novel, I was also becoming a performance poet. I met up with two other Latino poets who were working with me at San Francisco State, Norman Zelaya and Darren De Leon, and we created this group called Los Delicados. And so we did performance poetry kind of about being a Latino in California, responding to a lot of what we thought was like unfair characterizations of us in the media. We were very irreverent. We used to do poems that combined our influences that were very politically contradictory at times. So we'd write a poem celebrating, the revolution in Cuba, right? Celebrating Fidel Castro, but we'd also, celebrate the music of Celia Cruz, and we'd also talk about we come from poor backgrounds, so sometimes our diet isn't always that great. So we'd write about Popeye's chicken too. And so we'd put all these things together, and people didn't know what the heck we were talking about. What we were talking about is our experience, right? This is kind of how we live, We live in American consumer culture, but we also have a connection to our homelands, which are often politically, ripe with crisis. And so that doesn't leave us just because we live in the United States. We're still connected to where we come from, right? So we were this group called Los Delicados, which we took from the Mexican cigarettes. It was funny to call a bunch of really loud guys Delicado, right? But if you ever smoked the Delicado, they had no filter. So that was kind of the thing we used to always say, was that it's not because we're delicate, it's because Delicados come with no filter. There was no filter on our voice. We said exactly what we felt. And we did that. We toured up and down California for about, 4 or 5 years. At that point, I was also working with an organization called Youth Speaks. Was a couple of our friends, partners inside the creative writing program at San Francisco State, thought that the writing program was not diverse enough, that our professors were all white, that what we were reading wasn't really relevant to the community we wanted to represent in our writing. So the other students, we were only 3 Latino students in a program, creative writing program, 200 students, only 3 Latinos. We were the only 3. So we were like, we need to do something more about getting more Latinos to come, more African Americans, more Asian folks come to the writing program. And what ended up happening was we tried to solicit the hiring and new people to come apply, and then we also went to the schools and tried to get in the inner cities interested in writing poetry. So we started this program called Youth Speaks. We went into the San Francisco schools. We performed for kids inside their class. Then we invited them to free after-school workshops. And we offered them a used computer if they did it. And so if they came and finished 10 weeks of workshops, we would give them a used Apple computer. So we had about 20 kids. This was in 1996. We had about 20 kids do it. And then that grew, and we had the first teen poetry slam that year. So all these teenagers that participated in the workshops, they were invited to compete with their poetry, and we hosted the first teen poetry slam in San Francisco in 1996. And the winner actually got a brand new computer and some money. That grew and grew from there was 20 participants the first year to 60 the next year. The poetry slam for those kids went from 80 people watching to 150. And then from 1996 to 2000, we had 1,000 people watching the poetry slam, working with hundreds of kids. Then we started to travel all over the nation, basically going into youth centers and performing spoken word poetry, and then using a curriculum that we had, which was based on, poetry isn't really about the books that you're reading in class. Poetry is about the experience that you have in your own life and the voice that you use to express that experience, right? Your voice is poetic. You don't have anybody else. You can write the way you speak. And so we were calling it spoken word because we wrote the way we talked. We didn't write the way we had read books. We weren't trying to copy Robert Frost. No offense, I'm just saying. We thought it sounded better if you did a poem in the voice that you use when you talk to your homeboys, or when you talk to your friends, or when you talk to your mom, or when you're excited, or when you're really pissed. How do you sound when you're mad? Speak about something that makes you angry. And So we encouraged kids to speak from their own voice. A lot of them spoke with a real hip-hop sound. So spoken word and the work that we were working with in the beginning was very hip-hop influenced. So while I was touring with Los Delicados doing like really Latino-oriented stuff, I was also helping, teens in the city develop their voice, and growing a whole nonprofit organization called Youth Speaks. And we hosted something called Brave New Voices, which was the National Teen Poetry Slam, which grew from 6 cities sending their teens to now it's 53. It connected to over 1 million young people that write and do spoken word poetry. So all of that was to encourage young people of color to participate in poetry and literature. And that has been my goal ever since, was to help young folks who had been marginalized from participating in art to feel like their voice was valuable, as valuable as anything they read. And in fact, could actually, the development of their voice could give them all kinds of opportunities, not just to be a poet, but get a good job, or help a cause, or save somebody's life, or inspire somebody else to change their life. Like, that's exactly what we were talking about. It wasn't about we're trying to turn you into a superstar, It was about how are we helping you become the person you really want to be. And we thought that by, accessing the authenticity of your voice, right, and your passion, that you could actualize yourself, that you could become who you really want, if you had the courage to express it. So we made a real safe space so people could do that. And then we started working on theater, right? We started getting, these kids are writing really long poems. And so my pieces started getting longer. And so I went from, writing, 3 or 4 minute poems into like long monologues. And then I started collaborating with people. We started making theater, and we just did like, really basic theater, stuff about the community, or, issues like gentrification, police brutality. And then we added music, so we started doing theater, poetry, and music all at the same time, live music, dance. We started really being experimental and just let it all go. Be who you are. This is what we like. This is what we do. We like to go dance. We like to, participate in political activism. We love good sounding poetry. We love our culture. Let's put it all together. And then from there, I started, I got an opportunity to perform on HBO Deaf Poetry. And I was invited to submit a tape to perform on deaf poetry. And so I submitted a tape to the producer, one of the producers of Deaf Poetry, and then she liked my tape and she said, I want to see you live. At that point, it was 2000, this was the 2001, 2002, end of 2001, beginning of 2002, and I was on tour. I was actually performing at the Nuyorican Poets Cafe in New York, and I told her, I'm going to be at the Nuyorican, come see me. So the producer came to see me perform, me and my friend Bamuti. Liked both of our sets, and so she invited us to perform on HBO Deaf Poetry. So that was a huge thing for me, Remember, I was just this kid who was trying to get connected to his father through his writing, and next thing you know, I was on HBO Deaf Poetry doing a poem, and my poem was called Brown Dreams. And this poem was about how immigrants often sacrifice their life to get citizenship by joining the military, right? And how the military, in response to citizens who offer their lives to defend this country in order to get citizenship so they can have opportunities, when they die, citizenship that becomes a posthumous citizenship. In other words, the dead soldier gets a piece of paper that says he's a citizen. But there's no borders in heaven. So what's he going to do with that citizenship? He can't transfer it to his wife, can't transfer it to his kid. So I thought it was hypocritical. I thought it was another lie that the system used to get our people to sacrifice themselves. So I wrote this poem about it, and I put it on HBO. And you can see it now on YouTube. It's got over 100,000 hits, and a lot of people see that. A lot of the people in our community see that poem, and that really blew up a lot around, the Iraq War, but also around Latino identity and educating people. And then after I finished Deaf Poetry, I came back to San Francisco, and I had a different status inside the community. People now, were looking at me like I was different or something like that because I had been on a big old show, and then I started able to tour all over the nation. So I started getting invites to perform in Chicago in Miami, in Houston, in Nevada, in Seattle. I was all over the place, right? I was performing all over, and every time I went, a couple Latinos would come to my show, right? They'd be like, I saw the poem you did, and I want to talk to my class. So I did. I went to the schools and I went to the classes, and then I would meet teachers, and then I would meet librarians, and they'd be like, you know what? We need more Latinos to do what you do. So what started out as just me just doing a show became residencies. So then people would pool money to bring me for weeks. So I did like a 4 in Miami with a bunch of Latino teens from Little Havana, all of them Central American immigrants, right? And we worked on writing immigrants in the United States. And then from there I went to Houston, did the same thing for 4 weeks with a bunch of young Chicanos. Did like a 4-week residency. This is crazy. It's like all of a sudden this stuff just started happening. So I left my job at U Speaks and became like an independent artist. I just started working in the Latino community all over the United States. Texas, I would be in Vermont with Latinos. I would be in Nebraska. I would be in all these little towns where there were Latinos, who could find resources to bring me out so that I could help them develop their voice. And then from there, I started getting invited by social service organizations to do issue-oriented work. So one of those was the Central American Resource Center. So I'm Mexican and Cuban. I'm not even Central American, but they asked me if I would write a play about how Central American youth were getting involved in gangs, right when they come across the border, and how they were getting the tattoos of their gangs all over their bodies, and that when they decided they didn't want to be part of the gang no more, like they had to get the tattoos removed, and whether they were forced because of their probation to get the tattoos removed. Either way, there was some risk around it, because all of a sudden if they got their tat removed, then their gang thought they were snitching, so they were afraid to get them removed. And then there were also this kind of whole stereotyping and prejudice that was going around with, if you were a Latino tattoo, all of a sudden everybody thought you were a gang member. So it was like, Paul, can you work with these kids, get their stories, and turn them into a play? I said, yeah. So that's what I did. I spent a couple years interviewing a bunch of Central American youth who had gotten involved in gangs. I had a consultant with me named Alex Sanchez, and he helped me. He introduced me to some legit gang members as well as gang intervention workers. And I went to Los Angeles and El Salvador, interviewed people down there in the gang, and went into the prisons. Folks there, I interviewed mothers who had lost their children. And I turned that all into one play called Placas. And that play was, it premiered in 2012 in San Francisco, and I'm still touring it, and this is September 2014. So, it was obviously an issue that is important to our community, to understand how do we solve violence in our community, how do we help the youth in our community have a better opportunity, how do we understand the immigration issues that our community goes through. Because sure, we're born here, but we got that family member that's still trying to come up here, and sometimes, a lot of times in our home, immigrants, we got born here, we got undocumented, we got documented, so it's always going to be an issue for us. So I always, I think that my role as a poet and a writer is to represent what my community is going through, so that the work reflects exactly who we are and what we believe in, the good and the bad. I don't try to sugarcoat nothing. I feel like, I come from a place of love, but also from pain, and that always is seen in my work. And I encourage people to write the wholeness of your experience, not just the good, not just the bad. Celebrate your culture as much as you use your poetry to the injustice in the world. Celebrate your community, celebrate your life. Write poems that celebrate, but also write poems that criticize and fight the injustice in our world. So that's really what I think we should be doing as writers, and that's my story.
And one message to the Latino youth?
Yeah, don't be afraid to speak up. I think society expects us to be quiet and just accept whatever, whatever laws or whatever, a representation of us is out there. And we kind of just like, we don't come from a really loud community. We have respect for our family, and that's how we're taught. Our elders. Sometimes the elders be saying whack stuff. Don't be afraid to speak up. And if you need to do it in a poem, do it in a poem. But speak from what you think is just. And don't be afraid, You're going to be looked at wrong or be called stupid by your friends, because in the end, you become a leader by speaking up. And if poetry is your way of speaking up, great. If rap is a way of speaking up, great. If writing some rock en español is your way of speaking up, do it. But use your voice. It's your most important, probably most powerful tool you got.